if you would like them to introduce themselves and the work that you do one after the other. It all depends on you. So at this point, I'll just hand over to you. Once again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shagun. I'm so glad to be with you, and wonderful to meet you all. I was thinking that we'd do it this way. So I have a few slides to just give a brief introduction to sort of the overall, what are the global goals, what is kind of the status of implementation, how are we tracking it, and then just a few pieces of advice on how you can start to work with SDGs if you want to in your organizations. And I prefer, if you have questions along the way, just shout out, or Shagun, I don't know if you can kind of keep track on the chat to see if people have questions.
Yeah, I can do that.
Cool. And then, ask along the way, or we can have a Q&A after, whatever you guys prefer. So if that's cool with you, I'll just, I thought that I would give like a background, because I'm not sure how many of you already are familiar with the 2030 agenda, how many of you already are working with it. So I'll just run quickly through sort of the basics of it, yeah? If you've all seen my background, my background is in politics. So back in 2014, when the UN were negotiating sort of the new global framework to replace the Millennium Development Goals, I was at the time a government minister in Denmark. I was the Minister for Environment. So I was part of the team of the government of Denmark that traveled around the world, talking to my peers and my colleagues from other countries, of course, talking about the Danish government's priorities in these negotiations that were taking place at the UN. And at the time, I was getting increasingly encouraged to see the process that the UN had launched for this, because we had seen many times before that, UN negotiations, it very much happens in New York with the governments negotiating with each other. But for the first time, we actually saw a very intense like UN really tried to open up this process to have what they called an open working group that would collect inputs from all over the world, from civil society, from private sector, from academia, from every citizen who wanted to contribute. They made an effort to make sure that everyone had a chance to be involved in that process. So this was like, historically, this had never been done before, to come up with this new set of goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals. And what we saw also for the first time was that there was kind of an acknowledgement that we could no longer have like two parallel tracks with environment and climate in like a sidetracked from economic and social development. So Millennium Development Goals were very much focused on sort of the traditional development issues, economic and social development. There were 8 Millennium Development Goals, and now we were talking about a much larger and much more complex set of goals that would integrate for the first time the climate and environment dimension into the total set of global goals, which was, of course, groundbreaking, because it meant that it would no longer be possible to discuss like issues of poverty and hunger and education and health without also looking at how this is intertwined with the increasing challenges that the world is facing with climate and environmental issues. And so this acknowledgement was really what, in my view, of course, also being a Minister of Environment, was critical to making sure that we would actually have a possibility to be successful with achieving a world in harmony, a world in balance, both with the global north and the global south, but also a planet in balance. This is crucial to understand how groundbreaking the 2030 agenda really is, because that is what makes it much more holistic, and also much more our chances for success are bigger, because we have this acknowledgement as the basis of it. Right, so on your screen now, hopefully you have the 17 SDGs in front of you. Hopefully you've all seen these before. The goals have, with this visual platform that has been developed actually by a Swedish guy named Jakob Trollbeck. He developed all these beautiful icons that now symbolize the 17 goals that, most of us now are familiar with these. And to me, this has been a very important aspect of the goals, that we have this visual like identity for the goals. I think this is really, whether you like it or not, people need something that they can recognize. And I believe that these icons are very much part of the success of the SDGs, that we now have them to accompany our conversation around sustainable development. When we were negotiating the goals, I remember that many of my colleagues were saying, the Open Working Group presented 17 goals. This is way too many goals. No one will ever remember 17. The Millennium Development Goals, we had 8. No one really remembers them. How is it going to be when we have 17? But I really think that with this visual kind of identity, we have actually made it possible to have some sort of way to remember these goals. And I think this is actually really important. So we have 17. We have all 3 dimensions of sustainability in one set of goals. Economic, social, and environmental sustainability are all part of this this set of goals. Let me see how I can change to the next slide. There you go. So we have 17 goals, but we also have, in each of the 17 goals, we have a number of targets. And this is what this poster shows you. And Jakob Trollbeck now also developed an icon for each of the 169 targets. So you can have also a visual identity for each of the targets. So if any one of you are already working with this framework, you may already be familiar with, which targets are most relevant for your work. And you may already be familiar with these icons to kind of present the priorities that you have made. Otherwise, I would strongly recommend it. I'll come back to that. But just to say that, yes, we have 17 goals, but we also have 169 targets, which is really where we can be more familiar with the whole complexity of the framework, and also take a little bit more deep dive into, so what is it actually that we're supposed to be doing? The targets will tell you more about what exactly does it mean when we say, consumption and sustainable consumption and production. What does that mean? SDG number 12. Then you can see the targets. All right, this is what we have to achieve before 2030. On top of that, we also have 232 indicators. So for each target, there's also a specific indicator. I'll come back to that, but that's just to tell you that there are several layers in this complex set of goals. Right, so I always recommend, if you want to know what what world leaders were actually saying when they adopted the 2030 agenda, read the declaration. It's really interesting to read the declaration. Normally, maybe you think this is really boring, but this is actually, when I'm really depressed, I read this slide, because it says how ambitious our leaders were when they adopted this agenda. This is for the first time in the history of the UN that we have a universal agenda for sustainable development, 3 dimensions of sustainability in one. And this says that this is not anymore just a development agenda. Before the Millennium Development Goals, countries like mine, developed countries could say, okay, so we will increase or we will do this with our development aid, international cooperation, then that's fine. We don't have to change anything ourselves. But, this changed that completely, because now all countries and all stakeholders will implement this plan. This is what it says. So every country must integrate this in their policy planning. They must have action plans that tell how we are going to change to contribute to the transformation of our world. The headline of the declaration, I should have put that in there, is actually transforming our world. So it's not just, a little bit of change, it's actually a transformation, which is very ambitious. Then it also says that the goals and the targets are all integrated and indivisible. Indivisible means you cannot just cherry pick. You have to look at the complex set of goals. You have to look at the way that they are interconnected. So this is also, it's a big task. It's a huge, challenge, but it's also really important because, as I said, this is where it gets complex, yes, but this is also what increases our chances of actually achieving sustainable development. And then it says that all governments must also develop their own national targets. So it's not enough just to look at the global indicator framework. You have to also look at what kind of targets would we want to measure our progress in our country. So this is something that is not happening to a large extent. Some countries have done it, but it's, still we have a long way to go with that. And then there are lastly two really important principles behind SDGs, which will be really relevant, I guess, for many of you, because especially in a development context, leaving no one behind. And I'm sure if you're familiar with the agenda, you already know that this is like a basic principle. Leaving no one behind means that in our efforts to implement the 2030 agenda, we should always look at the 40% of our populations that are less or least likely to achieve the goal. So we have to look at the more vulnerable groups first, and this is how we should prioritize our efforts. So leaving no one behind is extremely important to have in mind when you start to implement this. Do no harm is where you will find kind of the human rights basis of it all. If you look at the 17 goals, you'll see that there's no specific goal for human rights. That does not mean that we don't need human rights as the basis for everything we do. And that is what the do no harm principle really expresses, is that you must always start from the principles of human rights when you start to look at how to implement SDGs. Right. So this model has been developed by a very good friend of mine, University of Copenhagen, a professor named Catherine Richardson. She was also part of the panel that Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of UN, appointed to do the development report for 2019, presented last September. So she has tried to explain kind of the relation between the SDGs in this way. And if you look at the right side of the screen, you'll see that, we have some of the goals which are targeted at the environment. So 13 on climate action, 14 on life below water, and 15 on life on land. This is sort of the core environmental goals. These are the goals that most developed countries have the biggest challenges with. So my country, Denmark, for instance, you'll see that in the next slide. We may be on a good path in general, when we look at the score on each SDG, but these 3 SDGs, we're really, really far from achieving these, because we have a huge climate footprint, because we have a huge resource footprint per inhabitant in the developed countries. These are where we really have to put our efforts. If you then look at the global south, you'll see that the goals to improve human well-being are where the main challenges will be in the global south. So we really here have an expression of, as I said, the universalism of the agenda, that even though some countries may perform really well on the human well-being goals, they perform really bad on the environmental goals. And as you can see as the link between this, she has put SDG number 10, which is inequality. So I guess this really expresses that, globally, we have enough resources and wealth to achieve the goals on human well-being for everyone in this world. We will also have that when we become more people in the world, but it will take a better distribution of that wealth, and it will take that we improve on goal number 10 on equality. And likewise, if we are to improve on the goals on environment, this will mean that the developed countries will have to change the way they produce and the way they consume. And developing countries will have to look to different paths to development that will not massively increase their footprints. So this is sort of a way to see, that everyone has challenges here, and basically inequality is or improving on inequality is the key. Then there are some levers for this transformation on the left side. So some of the other SDGs are these are some of the tools we can use in order to improve on environment and on human well-being. So to me, at least, this makes a lot of sense, and a way to kind of structure your thinking on the goals. So there is Professor Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University has developed this with his Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network of academics from all over the world working on sustainability. They have developed this SDG index, which looks at the indicators and how countries score individually on all the indicators. I didn't put this to brag at all, but actually to point out that even though, so my country, Denmark, is actually now leading this index, or at least we're number one. You can see our score here is 85.2, which means that, if we were 100%, we would have achieved all the indicators, but, we still have a long way to go. However, and this is what hopefully I think the next slide, yeah, you can see, so this is for each of the goals. They give you red, orange, yellow, or green, depending on how you are doing on each of the goals. So if you look at Denmark here, again, we're number one on the index, but we still have, we're not green all the way, not at all. Actually, we are lacking behind on a number of the goals. And if you look at, as I said, the environmental goals, so on consumption and production, climate action, and life below water, we're actually doing pretty badly. And some of this is really controversial to many people in Denmark, because we see ourselves as this very kind of green nation, and we've done a lot on renewable energy, wind turbines all over the place, but we actually still have a pretty long way to go. So this is something that can help you kind of get to this discussion about how your country needs to improve. And if you look at, so this is for Sub-Saharan Africa, the same kind of score. You will see also from the point I made before that this is, where are the biggest challenges? It's on the human well-being goals, but it is for many countries, it's more or less all around. But if you look at then the green targets out here, you can see that the biggest challenges here are not on environment. This does not mean that you shouldn't take this seriously, and that all over the world we have to look at our carbon footprint, our resource footprint, how we distribute our resources, and especially in a development setting. So when you want to achieve the human well-being goals, don't we have to make sure that it doesn't happen with a negative effect on the environmental goals. Right. So why should you in your organizations, in the settings that you work in, look at this agenda? Why should you try, and this is of course what I believe, try to implement a framework of sustainable development into your own work? So first of all, to me, this is self-evident. Everyone has to contribute. This agenda is so ambitious and it is so complex that everyone on every level, no matter where you work, you will have to ask yourself, how can I contribute? We only have 10 years left. This is already 2020. And we still all the reports we're getting are saying that we are not on track. We're not at all on track, so we have to do much more in order to achieve the transformation. So everyone must ask ourselves how we can contribute, because our future depends on it. These are really critical issues. So, and I don't want to bore you with this. I'm sure that everyone is familiar with what will the consequences be if we don't start working on our climate action, if we don't start working on stopping the loss of biodiversity, all these things that have to do with our our ability to get food, our ability to live in peace with each other, or have like just a minimum of security for our lives. This is like totally dependent on whether we are able to act on climate and on a biodiversity crisis. And also, whatever issue you are working on in your organization, this is an opportunity to be part of something bigger and to look at yourself as one actor, one stakeholder in a much bigger fight. And also to look at your if you use the framework, if you look at the targets, you will see that even though maybe you consider yourself as someone who is working with sustainability already, you are contributing to development, maybe you will find that actually you have some blind spots in the way that you approach sustainability agenda. And this is where the SDGs and the targets can come in as a very useful tool to analyze the work that you are already doing, to look at where can we improve our efforts. And then, of course, it's also a matter of attracting funding, because what we see now is that when world leaders say that these are the goals that the world will be working to achieve for the next 10 years, both impact investors and philanthropic foundations are also starting to look at this as a framework for their priorities. So it can also be a way to put yourself sort of in the spotlight of foundations or like investors who increasingly look at how we can contribute to the SDGs. And then it's also going to open up, and I'm sure, because this is what I've seen with a lot of stakeholders, is that it opens up your eyes to partnerships with organizations or even private companies, governments, city governments, that maybe before you weren't considering that these could be your partners. But now that we have a new language to talk about sustainable development, this will open up some new doors also for partnerships, and of course also internationally. And bottom line, this is about reaching more people with the work that you're doing, increasing your impact basically. So expanding your own horizon, expanding the partners that you work with, and also looking at if we find our blind spots, definitely we will be able also to do more and be more a part of that change that we need so desperately. So how to do it? As I said, it can be scary to look at this. I showed you the poster with 169 targets, and it can look like a lot of work. But my advice is really to familiarize yourself with the complexity of the agenda before you start cherry picking. This is the trap that I've seen many organizations and companies fall into, is that they think, all right, so this is a useful branding tool for us. We can use it for our communications and fundraising strategies, but they fail at the basic test to actually not just pick the SDGs that fit what they are already doing, but look at this as something that will transform and change the way they work. Because what is, evident is that if we don't change something, each of us can see, maybe I'm already doing some good stuff in the world, but I can also change some aspects of the way I'm working. And we all have to identify, what is it that I can do better? How is it that I can contribute to the transformation? So if you take one thing away from this, it's that, SDGs is more than a communication branding tool. It's a change agenda. It's something that is meant for all of us to change something. We have to do better tomorrow than we did yesterday. So this is like, I think the test for whether you whether you actually kind of accept the way it was meant to be a tool for you. So so it's really important when you start this journey that you have your that this is something your whole organization is in on, because you will not be able to do this like a one-man army in a big organization. If you have a board of trustees, it's incredibly important to bring them on board, to talk to them about how we can root this in the organization, how we can make sure that all layers in our organization are all familiar with this, that they accept that this is something that we have to be part of, that they know what their role in the implementation of the strategy you choose is, so that everyone will feel this is something that, I'm part of something bigger. My organization is part of something bigger, and I know what I'm supposed to do. I recommend, as I said, that you look at all 169 targets and that you always have in mind human rights, do no harm, and also leaving no one behind, which is probably going to be relevant for many of you. So how you can focus or target your efforts to the most vulnerable groups. And then once you've familiarized yourself with the whole complex, you will be able to identify not only the SDGs and the targets where you are already focusing your efforts, but also the ones that maybe you were not aware that your organization had an impact. This could be on environmental goals. If you're not used to working in the environmental field, maybe an analysis of your CO2 footprint, your resource footprint, your role in your local community when it comes to environmental sustainability. Try and look at this, because all of us can change something in this regard. So this is often something that is a blind spot to many organizations, but where you can really do a big difference if you start to identify your impact and also your footprints. Right, and then based on that analysis, you will be able to formulate your own strategic focal points and your own KPIs in order to say, how do we want to measure this transformation in our organization? How can we make sure that we also progress and that we evaluate on a regular basis how it's going? And then, of course, open your eyes to new partnerships. This is really where we see some of the magic happen, I think, is where we can suddenly we can see when private sector actors start to engage with civil society actors and even governments and city governments. This is where we can really co-create new solutions. So So this is something I find is really interesting to see what happens when all these kinds of actors come together. And then lastly, once you've done this, communicate. Of course, you should use this as a communication tool and a branding tool, but this is, my point is that's the last step on the ladder. So yeah, I'm sorry to if I have kind of made this into a much more complex thing. That was partly my intention, because this is a complex thing, and it's we have to take it seriously if we want to achieve a transformation of our world in the next 10 years. We're in a hurry, and everyone have to think about how we can be part of that change. So that was that's all my slide, Shagun. Happy to take any comments or questions from everybody.
Well, thank you so much. This is a very powerful presentation. I think I have a couple of questions myself, but I can see a couple of hands already, so I'll just call on them. But before I call on them, thank you so much for this presentation. For me, as a person, I've really not seen the SDGs, or I know about the SDGs. I know what SDGs I'm working about, but I've really not seen the SDGs explained in an integrated way like this. It's kind of reshaping my mentality about how to really integrate the SDGs into the work that we do. And I think this is a very powerful presentation. Thank you so much for it. Thank you. I'll start from Faut. So you can just introduce yourself, the work that you do, and then you can ask your question.
Good evening, ma'am. Hello, good evening, ma'am.
Hi, hello.
I'm Fuad Balogun. I actually I have a team I lead a team of that's an NGO that works our work is on water, sanitation, and hygiene. We are working on goal number 6 of the SDG, which of course is clean water and sanitation. The name of my organization is Water Trust Initiative, and I'm a co-founder and the team lead. And I want to thank you for the presentation. It's been inspiring, and I'm so happy to have actually had the opportunity of hearing from someone who was part, right from 2014, who was part of the conception of the SDGs, because our work is based on SDG, and it is important to have an idea from someone who is part of the whole concept till this moment. And again, I want to actually commend the Danish government, the Danish people, for what they have actually done in terms of the environment. And I think it's actually been evident in the SDG index, which of course has placed you, even if you want to brag, I think it is something that is worth it, and you should claim all the accolades. It's worthy of it. But my question is actually in two folds. And the first question is one that has to do with us, people like us who are young youth, hoping to make impacts in our field. And again, the second question is going to be for government. And my question is, that's the first question is, you have seen something worthy of it. Of course, being number 1 on the SDG index means you must have seen the benefits, you must have seen what it offers, what the SDG concept offers. Our whole work, of course, in Nigeria and in Africa, our work concentration has always been on SDG. But again, you want to ask most of our governments, do they really understand what this SDG entails? Most of the people who are working in the SDG space, do they really understand what the SDG entails and what it stands to, what they stand to gain from actually incorporating all of their strategies in the SDGs, which incorporates the social, the economic, and the environmental indices. So my question, the first question is, what have you seen from your point of view that can actually offer some inspiration to people like us, those in the developmental space, that can actually inspire us, something you feel like, something practical that you believe can actually help us to understand and to actually do our work better? That's my first question. Then the second question is, okay, we have a situation now, the coronavirus issue, and This is one thing that has actually espoused and actually underscored the importance of the global efforts and partnership in anything. There is a joke here in Nigeria that it is China actually ate the bat, but all of us have had to wash our hands. So this is something, of course, in any remote part of the world, an issue might occur, but on the developmental scale, it might actually affect the whole world. So what are governments actually doing so that it does not amount to like, oh, you are representative of the Danish government, the Denmark people, and you are doing your own bit, so that it does not, nobody is left behind in the scope of affairs, so that it does not amount to, oh, we are doing our own due diligence, you can go on and not do your own. Nobody, the world is a space, is a closed space. What can we do overall? And how are government actually pushing each other governments, to make sure that they contribute their quota and nobody is left behind ultimately? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent comments and questions, and so happy to meet someone who is working on water and sanitation. Yay. This was like a huge issue for me as a Minister of Environment. One of the goals that we were fighting to have as part of the SDGs. So I'm so happy that that you're working with that. And water is one example of a goal that has so many links to the other SDGs. So if you would look at water and the way it impacts health, education, gender equality, inequality, peace, how many wars have started because of lack of water. It has huge interrelations with all the SDGs on environment, so climate, biodiversity. Water is an incredibly important SDG, an incredibly important aspect of achieving sustainable development for so many other SDGs. So just encourage you really to look at not just SDG 6, but look at how it's interlinked with so many of the other SDGs, and how I'm sure the work that you are doing on water and sanitation is really impacting so many other aspects of development than the one that it's that it has to itself. So that was just a comment. So inspiration, I as I understood your first question, it's like what kind of inspiration can we look to help us understand this, how you work with this? Well, there are lots of examples, and specifically I'll give you one example on water. So what I've seen is that this is one area where some of the magic I talked about is actually happening. So one example, there's a Danish company called Grundfos working. They're manufacturing energy efficient pumps. They have entered into a partnership with the Danish Refugee Council, which is working in refugee camps all over the world to look at a new water system for refugees, which if you've visited a refugee camp, if you're familiar, I'm sure you guys are familiar with how we've been trucking water into refugee camps for decades, and leaving not a very sustainable impact on the host communities, or like making sure that water supplies are efficient. So what is being tested right now are new systems for water supplies for refugees, and this comes out of a partnership that grew out of kind of new ways of thinking around SDGs, how we can work together. So that's just one example that I have really huge expectations of what they're going to do. So yeah, my recommendation for inspiration would be look at the partnerships between private sector and civil society, and see how much they're progressing. And so for your last question, what I heard was that how we can make sure that governments are well, pushing each other, but also helping each other, working together to make sure that, you know, that we come out of this COVID-19 crisis as a stronger global community, and not a world where we are looking more to ourselves, where we see much focus on sort of each nation state, but where we can increasingly work together. Because you're right, this really shows how interconnected the world is and how dependent we are on each other. That's not a bad thing, but we need to make sure we have systems in place that enable us to tackle situations like this. And for that, we need international cooperation. There's no doubt about it. What we're, like you said, what our government's doing. So for Denmark, so I have to say I'm not part of the Danish government anymore, so I can't speak for the government, but I can tell you a little bit about what they are doing. So our Minister for International Development has increased the budget to assist partner countries in the global south with dealing with COVID-19 crisis. So this is just one effort that is being done right now. But in general, we are now looking into, and I'm looking into this with the Minister for Development Assistance, whether we can actually work with our partner countries in the global south to have like a concept and a model for SDG implementation. So some of the experiences that we have from the Danish context is how we can build, for instance, cross-party alliances in our national parliaments. So this is one thing that, you know, I headed this all-party group in the Danish parliament, which was a success in the sense that we got the SDGs on the agenda. And I think this is really important, to get your parliaments involved and make it a cross-party effort. Get your governments to develop not only the regular reports to the UN on how you're doing on the UN indicators, but develop national targets. So this is one aspect that I'm discussing with our minister right now. How can we assist governments to develop these national targets and baselines for SDG implementation, which is a really useful tool to look at where are your biggest challenges, where should your efforts be prioritized. So just to give you an idea that we're definitely looking into how we can work together with other governments and how we can use the partnerships that we already have in the global south to strengthen this implementation. Yeah.
Thank you, Ma.
Yeah, next question would go to David. No, sorry, Fatih. I think I saw Fatih's hand earlier.
All right, thank you very much, sir. All right, thank you very much, Ma. Christine, it was a very wonderful session. Thank you very much for the exposition and everything. All right, so to my questions, you talked about checking for blind spots in our approaches. Quite a number of us, including myself, who lead the Yatta Scholarship Initiative, which is an organization that looks into increasing accessibility to quality basic education for indigent children in Nigeria. Now, how does someone like me find or discover or is able to identify the blind spots in my approach? That's one. And then two, I think most times we focus, when we talk about the SDGs, we focus a lot on government and the NGOs, which are in the public space and all that. Now, my question is about the public-private partnerships and the interactions. What role do you suggest that public-private partnerships play in the achievement of SDGs? So two questions. One, which is on how do I identify blind spots in my approach as an organization that is solving the problem of inaccessibility to quality education for indigent children in Nigeria. And two, the roles public-private partnerships play in achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent questions, very to the point. So I'll try and make my response to the point as well. So how do you identify the blind spots? I recommend, as I said, that you familiarize yourself with the whole complex of the 169 targets and with the interlinkages between the different goals, because that will, and I'm sure that this is the experience you will have, will also make you think about, and this is an effort you can really do with your whole organization. I really recommend, doing a workshop, doing a 2-hour session with your organization where you sit down and look at this and have a conversation with each other about, yeah, we're working on education, so you're SDG 4, right? But we are also impacting so many other aspects of sustainable development with the work that we do. So you are most probably also looking at, I know that this is the case for many organizations working with education, is feeding children when they're in school. So maybe you're also providing them a meal, right? So that's SDG 2. Maybe you're also having a gender angle to your work. So making sure that, girls have access to education as well. So you're also working with SDG 5. But so this is a mapping that you can probably, I would say, do in a couple of hours workshop. What you will find then, if you start to look also at the sustainability targets on the environmental side, is that most organizations, even though this is not part of the way that you usually work or usually, think about, you will definitely have an impact, right? So we all have an impact. So when you start looking at this, you can have you should definitely be looking at, so how can we improve our footprints? How can we make sure that the way we transport ourselves, the way that the meals that we serve, the way that we handle different aspects of this could be also water related. Could there be something that we could do better when it comes to environmental footprint? So this is just one thing that I've experienced with many organizations, that maybe they didn't usually think about this, but everyone can improve somewhere. So I would recommend for you to do a workshop with your organization, get your team on board in this effort. And what you should end up with is to identify 3 goals that where your current work is focused, which is where you have your main impact. So that could be SDG 4 in education, it could be on hunger, and it could be gender. This is just, an idea. And then you should also identify 3 goals where you can improve your effort. Maybe something that you didn't think about before, something that would be new to you, to start to explore how can we actually improve on these different 3 goals. So that would just be an idea. Public-private partnerships is totally key. So this is something that, there is SDG 17 is partnerships, right? So there's a whole SDG for partnerships, which means that this is kind of, so the first 16 goals is like, this is what we want to achieve. SDG 17 is how we can achieve that through partnerships. So we cannot achieve this if we don't work together. And public-private partnerships especially are useful if you can, through cooperation between the private sector and the public sector, start to identify barriers. So you need to work with the public sector, you need to work also with your legislative bodies and your government to identify barriers for development. And this is where public-private partnerships can come in handy, also when it comes to, of course, funding of initiatives. But I would say it's critical that it's not just between private sector and governments. It needs also to involve civil society. There needs to be a civic engagement effort in this. So I can tell you what we did in Denmark is that we established a multi-stakeholder platform where we involved not only private sector, but also civil society and academia, educational institutions, youth. So we had the Danish Youth Council aboard. So make sure that you have all these stakeholders around the table when you start to identify solutions.
Great. Thank you very much, Ma. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think I have 3 more questions left. And so I'll call on David, then Omotoyosi, then the other David, then we'll allow Christine to go. I know we're taking so much of our time already. So David. If David is not ready, can we have a multi?
Hello.
Okay, he's here. All right.
Hello. Good evening, ma.
Good evening. Yeah,
Okay.
you can ask your question now.
Okay. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for your presentation. I was not surprised seeing Denmark at the top of the dashboard. I must say your ambassador to Nigeria here is one of the key persons leading the campaign for SDGs. I've had the opportunity with other young SDG experts to meet with him several times, and I must commend that you are doing excellently well. Your country is doing well, like helping Nigeria to achieve the SDGs. Yeah, thank you so much, ma. Now, my question, you talked about the SDGs being more of a transformation than just a brand or a communication. Yeah, as the Minister of Environment then, and also with your key experience in the SDGs, how did how did you move your country from just the advocacy level, like the talking level, into taking real actions to be able to achieve the 85% that you had been at the top of the dashboard? Was there any policy, a particular policy that you developed to track both the government and the NGOs in order to measure the funding with the impact level at the national level?
Great, thank you so much. So I guess I would approach this question by saying that so Denmark has a different starting point because I think our score on many of the human well-being SDGs were already high. So you can't say that, you know, this is something we've done within the last 5 years. So we have a different starting point because a universal welfare system, you know, we have through like hundreds of years basically has been built. So so this is like an important thing to remember, I guess, that you know countries score differently also because of different like starting points, right? But as I said, we also we have huge challenges when it comes to especially the environmental goals. So how did we approach this, and particularly on measuring impact and specific policies? So what we did, I you know I was in so when the SDGs were adopted, I was back in opposition, back in parliament. So what we did was we established this all-party group that I chaired to make sure that we hold our government accountable. So this is a really important thing, that you have a parliament that holds your government accountable and make sure that you have a way to measure your national efforts. So what we did with this parliamentary forum and the multi-stakeholder platform that we established was that we started to develop a national baseline, which means that we develop, and this work is actually still ongoing, developing national indicators that supplement the UN indicators, but which looks at the transformative actions that we need to take. So this is to make sure that we don't lean back and say, great, we're number one, so we don't have to do anything, right? This is a reaction that I see with many Danish people when they see this index, is that, great, so we're good, we don't have to do anything, but every country needs to do something. So this baseline is what is supposed to help us to identify our challenges. So where are the biggest challenges in Denmark, and how can we then start to develop actions that can take us to, for instance, our 70% climate target, which has been, so this is one thing that the government has done, is that it has adopted a climate action plan, which says 70% reduction of CO2 in 2030. So extremely ambitious climate targets, but we have yet to identify the actions that will take us there. So I guess what I'll say is that governments need to show a political will to adopt ambitious targets, but the multi-stakeholder effort, I guess, is to identify the actions that will take us there, and to make sure that that is, of course, it's a government role to make sure that we have the regulation in place, but it's also an effort by private sector and civil society to make sure we get there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. We'll take the last question for today, and Dave, I would like you to keep it as short as possible. Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Good evening, good evening. First question I have there is I want to ask. I study your records on the internet, and I realized that you got into politics early in life. Can you tell us how your involvement in politics has helped your advocacy, your commitment to social development beyond being in government? Because we feel like in our country here, when most people are out of government, they seem to be out of impact. So how has your involvement into politics, into governance, helped your being very learned and vast in the SDG advocate and other things? The second question I would like to ask is, in a time like this of a global pandemic, for someone who is working on goal number 8 and what your work is limited, you have to stay indoor and the like, to what extent can you switch, at least momentarily, to make impact in for now? To what extent can you switch? Are we so limited to what we are doing, or you have permission to switch and make impact? I think the last one I want to ask is when we were doing delivery on the SDGs, I was looking at for something on the framework of an SDG advocate. What should be the composition, the character, the embodiment of somebody who will be successful being an SDG advocate? Thank you, man.
So I need someone to, because I didn't catch the first question. So Shigun, I don't know if you can help me.
Yeah, so I think the first question it was asking was that he said when he studied your bio, he realized that you started early in life in politics, and that how has that contributed to your career project trajectory, especially in terms of your advocacy work for the SDG and for sustainability generally? How does starting early and the political experience, how does it contribute into that? And I think his second question was about, now the third question is jumping to me. The third question is what are the characteristics and embodiments that you would expect to see in a person that is an SDG advocate like yourself? And the second question, I cannot remember the second question.
I think that was something on SDG 8. As I heard it, it was like, I'm working on SDG 8. Can you talk about that in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis? Is that true?
Yeah.
Can you switch to another to a pertinent need that is out of your SDG?
Yeah, I got it now. So he said as working on a particular SDG, and if that work is in that others in such a time as like this, that we have a pandemic, how can we pivot into another focus or another SDG?
Yeah.
Or
right. Okay.
How far can we go?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be really brief because I know we're short on time. But so my trajectory I was 27 when I was elected to Parliament, and I spent 14 years as a member of Parliament, and then, then I felt I needed a break to shake my head, and that's why I did this Obama Scholars program this year, because I needed to I needed to step back and kind of reflect and think about, also the things that I had been doing and working on, because I felt like some of the issues that I feel really passionate about, so sustainability, climate action, and these things, I felt that, the way that, so politics is often really slow. So I guess I was a little bit impatient. I felt like we need to move much faster than this is actually going right now. And so my experience this year has been, basically trying to think about how I can scale the work that I'm doing. Of course, drawing on the experience as a politician and as, a person who, has worked inside that machine for many years, and I know how that works. How can I, maybe from the outside try to impact even more? So I'm still trying to figure that out. But one thing I know is that from looking very much on my own national context of implementing SDGs, what I'm going to be doing from here is working much more on an international level and as like a global SDG advocate, and hopefully making partnerships on a global scale. So so that's kind of where I am now. So for the second question, how can you talk about SDG 8 or other SDGs in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis? And I'm struggling with that myself because, this is a global thing. We're all in this together. And how, so this is how I think about it. Right now, I think everything is focused on public health and how to make sure that, we do not crash completely due to this crisis. So of course, everything will be focused on our health efforts and our health systems. But I believe very strongly that coming out of this crisis, when we are challenged with, our economies are going to be struggling. And so we need to look at how we can rise up, how we can make sure that our economies get back on track. This is where SDGs will be extremely important as a tool to make sure that economic recovery does not take us back to where we were before, but take us into the future for a much more sustainable way to grow economically. And that's how I think, if you're working on SDG 8, which is growth and jobs, you will need to look at how, coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, how can we make sure that growth is sustainable growth and not just growth like in GDP growth, right? So the last question, what does an advocate look like, SDG advocate? I think everyone should be an SDG advocate, no matter where you work, in a private sector or in a civil society organization, wherever. We all need to be SDG advocates. So there's no description, but what I would say is that a fundamental understanding of the complexity is crucial. So someone who understands that this is, it's a complex task, and it will take, a lot of efforts from everyone to do this, and it needs to be someone who can see, what partners to bring together, what teams to bring together to find the solutions that will help us be successful.
I totally forgot I was muted. My other device went off. I forgot to charge it. Thank you so much, Kirsten. I don't know how. I'm speechless because I'm meant to be the organizer here, but I've actually really learned a whole lot today. And this really means a lot to all of us, and we really appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for sharing with us so deeply and in such a very clear way. I would go back and watch this video again, because I think everyone that runs an organization or that has an ecosystem should actually go back and look at how we can actually integrate the SDGs into the work that we do. And like I said earlier, one what makes this presentation really special for me is not the fact that it's about the SDGs. Like, a lot of people talk about the SDGs. We all know about the SDGs, but no one is actually really talking about how to integrate, how to start, how to plan for it and all of those things that you've mentioned today. And it's really just made a lot of sense to me and switched some light bulbs on. And I'm really happy today happened. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. And do have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Shogun, for having me. Wonderful to have this conversation with you guys.
Good
I wish
night.
you luck, and I hope you'll go out there and be SDG advocates, all of you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
man.
you. Thank you. Enjoy the
Listen.
night too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, guys. So I think that's like most of the things we need to cover today. And